Hi, everyone. This is the second half of the interview that we're doing on fecal transplants. These series that we're doing on ancient science meets modern science. Another way to talk about that is modern science is catching up with ancient science. We're going to spend just a couple minutes in this video talking a little bit more about fecal transplants, and then we're going to go on with my guest, Marty Wittekin, to talk about this whole question of intestinal flora, the question of bacteria in the body. And I remind you, Marty's author of a wonderful book, The Probiotic Cure, which is really very up-to-date information on this whole question of intestinal flora, how we are, the bacteria, the role it plays in our life. But Marty, let's talk a little bit more. About fecal transplants. I was just reading in this one journal that fecal transplants have been used since 2013, approved by the FDA for experiments for many disorders, from gastrointestinal diseases, colitis, constipation, irritable bowel, and even neurological conditions like multiple sclerosis and Parkinson's. In fact, I've seen clients who got very good dramatic benefits from digestive disorders. I didn't realize the neurological ones. Maybe fill us in just a bit more about fecal transplants and what we know and what you're expecting to see.
Well, just to review for people who just joined us at this point, that a fecal transplant is taking the entire intestinal content from a healthy person and putting it into a person who's got a disease. Mm-hmm. And because of the dramatic results that were found with the C. difficile that we talked about in the introduction, that inspired a lot of research, some of it human, some of it animal. But because our gut contents of these microbes control so much of neurotransmitters and how we think and our behavior and every aspect of our functioning, they're doing mostly like animal transplants, but they would take, for example, a strain of fat mice and a strain of skinny mice and swap the intestinal contents, and guess what? They changed. If they were fat, now they're skinny, and vice versa.
That's amazing.
And they're for psychosis, they're now thinking that maybe something like schizophrenia is caused by a bacteria or a virus, and therefore since most of our immune system, something like 70 or 80% of it is in the gut, that maybe there's something there. So I think probably we aren't going to have just a rash of fecal transplants, but the message out of that is how important the gut bacteria are. And so any ways that we can improve that environment by feeding the bacteria better, not killing them off with chemicals and so on, and maybe continuing to add more bacteria and doing the fermented foods and stop sanitizing the heck and pasteurizing the heck out of everything so that we can have a rich, diverse gut bacteria. There's no telling how many different conditions it might affect, because in the book, if you look at the citations in the back, there's like 450 of them.
Very immense.
Every imaginable journal, every discipline is interested in this now.
Well, and you help us focus on the fact we're starting to be amazed at what we can see when we take poop from one person, put it in another, one animal to put it in another, and we're only starting to discover the many implications when we set up a new regulation in the intestinal environment. But let's think about the simple things we each can do to enhance that intestinal health. Like you said, we think it's very excellent to sanitize everything. We run around with sanitizer here and there, and yet we are destroying the bacteria that are, what do they say, 9 out of 10 cells in the body are bacteria. Not human, but bacteria. And so we get that from all our interactions with the environment. Certainly the way we sanitize things, certainly the fermented foods was before refrigerators, much of the food was fermented because it would just naturally rot, or we fermented it on purpose as a way to store food. And certainly all these fermented drinks that we all love, let's have a good cheer for beer, I guess. Tell us a bit more, Marty, what people can do to tone up the environment of their intestine. Maybe they don't have to do a fecal transplant, but what they can do to help enhance as you mentioned, the prebiotics, the feeding of the bacteria is such. First, you got to get the bacteria there, then you got to feed them. So give us some tips.
Okay, great question. One last thing on fecal transplant, an animal study to show how diverse this is, not just the weight loss, but they took 2 strains of mice, one that's very timid and kind of laid back, likes to sit in the corner, and then these other aggressive mice, swapped the intestinal contents, and the behavior changed with the bugs, because not only are 90% of the cells in our body bacteria, almost 100 times more of our DNA comes from the bacteria than from our own cells. So we got to start paying attention to these little critters. And what it turns out as far as feeding them, all of the diets that have a great reputation, which we've had for health, that we've had trouble reconciling, because this one has more protein and this one has more plant-based, and then there's the Mediterranean diet, and we have trouble figuring out. Well, it turns out that the bacteria like real, wholesome, natural foods. They don't like processed foods. They don't like the chemicals that come along with it. And all of those diets, what they have in common is they don't include a lot of processed junk food. And so they will adapt to a more animal-based diet or a plant-based diet, as long as it's the real thing and it doesn't come with a lot of added chemicals and processing out.
Yeah,
And
so it might almost be like the absorption of nutrients. When we give people vitamins, if we have a lot of additives and fillers and colors, they aren't absorbed as well. And the same thing with that bacteria, they just want pure natural food. What an interesting thing. And lots of fiber. I understand fiber really is helpful.
well, that's a major food source for them, and they take the fiber, which we cannot digest. They digest it and turn it into fatty acids that make the lining of the intestinal tract healthier and kind of energize it and feed those cells. So when we think of fiber, I think most people would probably assume, well, it's the bulk. Well, it's holding water. Yes, it does that, but the main thing it does is it energizes our bacteria, feeds them. They in turn help get the peristalsis going and moving things along. So it's very complicated, and we have to start thinking that like a pregnant woman says, I'm eating for 2, we're eating for trillions. We've got a team down there that we need to feed very well, and we've got to stop as much as we can poisoning them with chlorine in the water and secondhand antibiotics in poorly raised animal foods, and too many medications where a natural approach would work. To the extent that we kill them off and don't feed them well, we are farming weeds instead of good plants.
Yes, that's very interesting. And even simple things like chlorine in the water, or simple things like eating the whole food. Like, for example, we eat broccoli, but some people we take the flower. But if you eat that whole stalk, that's very fiber-rich kind of stalk, and the lower part on the asparagus and the skin on the apple and all those things, we're going to get more of those fibers that all those many bacteria need to eat.
Oh, exactly. And it kind of rolls us back to your theme about the ancient. Well, our bodies are attuned to what our ancestors ate. Just because in the last 100 years we've totally remodeled the food supply, that doesn't mean that their needs have changed. We need to be eating. You don't have to make it complicated and be strictly paleo or anything, but it really does have to go back to real food as close to nature as you can make it.
And then and that same line of thinking, that our genetic mechanisms are suited to eating whole foods, lots of plants, eating a great variety of foods. Native peoples that I study would eat 100 different types of vegetables, where we made 3 or 4. And this takes us back to the pH balance, which is something we at the Center for Better Bones have worked on a lot, that our kidneys and our whole chemistry is set to work best in a slightly alkaline state. And for that, we need a lot of plant food. We need a lot of whole food. We don't need food additives and excessive salt and all these processed foods, because they don't provide the base precursors that we need. So there's so many good reasons why we should take the common sense. We go to a grocery store, there's 50,000 choices. The common sense of going to the Whole Foods and in fact eating a little more simply and eating that not only whole foods, but as much of the whole part of the food as we can.
Well, back in, and even to this day, in some what we call primitive cultures that actually are more advanced than we are in what they eat, they have 150 ingredients in their diet.
Yes, exactly.
We, on the other hand, are maybe more like 15, because you go through the center part of the grocery store, it's the same half dozen ingredients, just flavored differently, flattened out, made into a flake, different variations on the theme.
That's true. And I remember the Bushmen of the Kalahari, they did some studies, like 70 different species of plants these people would use. And we think, oh, that desert, what is there out there? But every nut and seed, every grub, every leaf, that's such an interesting thing how we've restricted our diet. And in Japan, what they had for a long time was the eating guidelines were eat foods of every color every day. I mean, that's still far away from 70 different things, but to say that, you have purple, red, orange, green, you pay attention to the color of food. But I like that concept of—
And not jelly beans, that doesn't count.
Yeah, right. Jelly beans do not count. I like the concept of thinking, like I once had this is very interesting. A woman from tribal Africa was here in this town I live in, and I happened to have the chance to hire her to come do some work with me, and I was cooking a squash. And so I cooked the squash and I took the seeds out, and she said, "What are you going to do with the seeds?" I said, I'm going to throw them out. And she said, "No, that's the very best part." And I said, "How do you use it?" She said, "Well, we dry them and then we grind them up and make a flour out of it." And this was a woman who actually lived in tribal Africa, who actually got here because some Dutchman came down to her country, gave her father 20 cows and took her back. I mean, it's that kind of really traditional society. And it just reminded me how we often throw out the best part of food. And we see that with traditional peoples that they use. I live with the Bari Indians in Colombia. They would cook up these little birds. They'd catch these little birds in these immense caves. How they caught them, I don't know. It was dark. They had bows and arrows. And they would cook that whole thing up in a little fire, and they would just eat the whole thing. Like my friend, one of the native people said, "Well, we eat everything. They just chew up the bones, chew the whole thing." There are little birds. They chew everything that was in that bird. They just eat it up.
Well, in this country, we take the whole plant and then we divide it up into pieces, and then they'll sell you the rest of it back in some, as a supplement.
Exactly. We take all the good oils. Right.
They'll take the wheat germ out and then sell it back as a supplement or as vitamin.
Right. Or take the fibers out. Right. So
Yeah.
we're going to be all thinking about
one important point on that before we leave the topic is that different bacteria like different foods. So to the extent that you eat variety, you end up with more diversity in the intestinal tract. And that's important because the bacteria tend to have different specialties for what they do. That's why we want to maintain a very diverse community of bacteria. And so the more we can eat variety, the more that's what we're going to end up with.
That's such a good point. How many species of bacteria are there in the human gut, do you think?
I've heard estimates upwards of 5,000 of subspecies, but there are at the least hundreds, which is what, when people go to supplement probiotics, they've got to remember that if you throw in even 20 strains and a few billion, it's peanuts compared with what's there. The most important thing is maintaining a good environment.
Marty, do you think it's worthwhile taking probiotics? What's your thought on that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because every day we're doing things that harm our good bacteria, and even dead probiotic bacteria perform a service because there's information in their cell walls and in their DNA. They help to maintain a better environment for. And when I say there are thousands of subspecies, yours are different than mine. Mm-hmm. And you can, families tend to be similar and so on, but there's no way we will ever have a supplement that is that complicated. So, but every time we take good bacteria or we eat fermented foods, we're getting a kind of a booster shot and we're improving the living situation for whatever collection we have.
So it's so important to remember that these bacteria carry information, like you said, in their cell wall. And even if they're not vital, they're not living, we can still get some of that information. And it's important to remember that we should nourish the bacteria. I saw a recent study, one of these researchers that I know has been working a long time with corn fibers, and they actually find that they're enhancing the absorption of calcium, that the bacteria that like that corn fiber flourish, and they help us absorb calcium. So we're going to see so many ways that variety of aspects of our health. And like you said a minute ago, we're going to realize we're a village. We're not just a distinct human being. We have a whole society, a whole vast society of many different species and many different organisms within us, all contributing to make this unique human with higher consciousness.
And we need to keep that in mind as we go down the road and we start seeing prescription strains of probiotics, because that's the great dream of a pharmaceutical company, is to find a bacteria that does a job, patent it, and then make it by prescription, and it will be expensive. But that doesn't mean there aren't 20 other strains that do that same thing. So we can kind of head off the need for that sort of drug approach to our microbes if we work on having a diverse, rich, healthy assortment because of the things that we've just been talking about.
Great. So our take-home tips might be exactly that: to eat a variety of foods, include the whole food, use whole foods, include the whole parts of the food. Try to be special attention to fermented foods. Try to take foods that are going to be friendly to our bacteria. Use probiotics, great idea, but don't rely on those, because we need to nourish the probiotics, and we can get so many probiotics just from the food itself that is also covered with bacteria.
Well, take a carrot, for example. Everybody peels a carrot, but you're peeling off some of what would have been normal bacteria that we would be getting. And we found that children who get to play out in the barnyard and are around animals, they have a more diverse microbiome, less likely to have allergies and asthma and so on. So we maybe ought to just pull back a little bit on the modernization and stop focusing so much on how we can kill bacteria and more how we can farm them and have a good assortment in our intestines.
And the final remembrance is 90% of the cells in our body are bacteria. So take care of that bacteria, invite new ones in. The good bacteria will help control the bad bacteria. It's really fun to be alive at this time. We're seeing so many exciting things as we see how we are part of a whole universe of energy and really in constant flow with our environment. Marty, thank you very much for sharing with me. Everyone, Marty Wittekind, The Probiotic Cure. It's a fascinating book, very well researched. It'll give you those tips about how to maintain the healthy gut and really make our bacteria happy.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always fun. I'd do this every week if we could.
But we'll continue on. Everyone be well. We'll talk later. This is Susan Brown on Susan Brown YouTube channel. Bye-bye.